Okay, good afternoon and welcome to all the Penn Staters joining us today. I'm Ryan Jones. I'm the Interim Executive Officer of the Penn State Alumni Association, and I want to welcome everyone to today's virtual speaker session that focuses on evaluating white wine interest in Pennsylvania. A little bit of housekeeping up front here. Live closed captions are available. You can access them by clicking the closed caption button at the bottom of the Zoom video window and then clicking Show Subtitle. You may also customize your caption view by clicking the Stream Text link posted in the chat. And we are live streaming today's presentation, which will also be archived and available on our website. So now turning our attention to today's research topic. The selection of a signature wine for Pennsylvania could serve as a valuable marketing tool, as many states and countries have signature wines for which they are known and which drive tourism and interest in the area. Today's guest, Dr. Kathy Kelley, is a professor of horticultural marketing and business management at Penn State. She'll discuss the process for selecting a signature wine for Pennsylvania, share some of her research results, and examine the implications of what has been learned so far. Dr. Kelley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. And hello, everyone. I hope you are having a great day. I'm going to share my screen with you and we'll get started. So hopefully you can see the screen over here with a bunch of grapes on the right-hand side. And yeah, okay. So again, thank you very much for joining today. I just want to give you a little bit of my background and then we will kick it off as far as what we'll discuss today. So I've been at Penn State for almost 24 years. It'll be 24 years in November. And I have a teaching, extension, and research appointment. Majority of my time is spent in extension. About 50% of my appointment is an extension. And one of the things I love about my job is that I get to work with small businesses and help them build or enhance their marketing strategies for their businesses. And about 2008, 2009, I really got an interest after I got tenure and promoted that I wanted to really focus on the alcoholic beverage industry, in particular the wine industry. I find it so enticing to be able to take a raw product and turn it into such a value added product like wine, and then of course we have some wines that are fairly expensive collector's items, and I think you can get an idea as to why that might make me very interested in the topic. And it's just there's so many different instances that you need to be aware of, things that you need to be aware of, and as well as a lot of problems that you might expect that can occur in a vineyard and winery and at market. So with that, I'll get us started. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about the alcoholic and beverage industry in the US, in particular consumption and purchasing behaviors. There were some questions that I received from the audience as when they were registering as to some of the questions that they had about the just consumption in general, and in particular, what would be something that could be done for the wine industry to make it more appealing to younger consumers, where we know that overall alcoholic beverage consumption is declining in globally, and then within the US, there's been a lot of concentrated efforts on trying to figure out what those Gen Zs, those legal drinking age 21 to 28-year-olds, what we can do to get them interested in the alcoholic beverage and increase their consumption if they are already imbibing. Certainly, we don't want to force people to drink alcohol, but if it's something that is interest to them, we want to make a product, market it in a way that is going to appeal and encourage them to purchase, especially some wines from the Pennsylvania wine industry. Talk a little bit about the Mid-Atlantic wine industry along with that, and then get into the Grüner Veltliner research that we conducted. So as far as consumption and purchasing, so you may be well aware that, we've over time, we see these blips and you see these valleys and these highs as far as consumption of alcoholic beverages. And so this is from the Gallup group. And so this is a data that I like to refer back to because they've kept track of consumption trends for several decades. And so I like to have this historical kind of resource that I can refer back to. And each July, they haven't yet published it for this year because I bet they're still collecting the data. But each July, they ask consumers 18 and older. So you can see that this does include those consumers who are below the legal drinking age of 21 in the U.S. Do they on any occasion have the imbibe in beer, wine, spirits, alcoholic beverages? And so this could be once in the last year, or it could be on a very frequent basis, such as every day or more than once a week. But this is on any one occasion, did somebody choose to consume an alcoholic beverage? And you can see those numbers kind of flip around a little bit, between 60 in most cases to 67%. And then the one that we have for 2024 is 58%. And we haven't seen that percentage that low since 1996. So there's been a lot of talk that, yes, over time there are these highs and lows as far as consumption. But, now we're in a situation for the past, 5, 10 years where we have a lot of different alcoholic beverages that have entered the marketplace and that are stealing share from our traditional spirits, traditional beers, and traditional wines. So if we take a look at who is consuming alcoholic beverages and the percentage of those who are choosing not to, this is another data source that I like to test. And so basically they have done a number of research studies where they've asked consumers, and you can see who they're targeting, what their sample is. Do you have any on any occasion, have you consumed alcoholic beverages? So we can see that from their data set for 2024, that about a quarter of those who they surveyed were teetotalers, meaning that they didn't necessarily drink alcoholic beverages. And when they further investigated the percentage of those who didn't imbibe and took a look at generations, where we have our Gen Zs, again, those are our younger consumers who, there are a percentage of them who are below the legal drinking age of 21, but certainly a lot of focus is on them because of the large size of the consumer segment, the knowing that they are spending more money on experiences, that they have some more discretionary income available than previous generations when they were in their age, that, there's a lot of positives about this generation that marketers are really trying to focus on and learn from, because in the future they may become those alcoholic beverage consumers of their parents' generations. But what we know is that there are certain instances, certain behaviors, certain attitudes that prevent consumers from drinking alcoholic beverages. And these are just this is just a short list of some of those that a test found as far as those that are preventing Gen Zs who don't drink alcohol from doing so. So there's quite a bit of interest in learning about these different attitudes, these different behaviors, and then finding a way to appeal to these consumers where maybe we can dispel rumors, we can dispel myths, we can make alcohol more approachable, and hopefully, satisfy those who would like to consume the beverage but don't necessarily at this time. Now, when we take a look at other frequencies, there are the occasional consumers, and they would consume alcoholic beverage on maybe a couple times a year, certainly less than once a week, which would be our frequent frequent consumers. And then we have those who consume on the weekend. And if we take a close look at those who frequently consume alcoholic beverages, we can split them further into those that consume on most days and then several times a week. So there's data out there. There are data out there that really show, some alcoholic beverage consumption patterns and really, support other data where it's other researchers that are trying to learn about attitudes and behaviors. But we do get the sense that this is an overall picture of consumption in the U.S. as of 2024. So if we were to focus on those who drink alcoholic beverages and exclude those who don't necessarily consume at this time, we could take a look at research that's been published by EPG. And so they had a series of reports that they published in 2024, where basically they took a look at the different industries, beer, spirits, and wine, created some particular reports based on those individual individual categories and then together put together a report on, well, we know that consumers aren't just drinking one alcoholic beverage over another in some cases. So what are consumers drinking if we wanted this real complete picture? So you can see here from their data that 4% of those who participate in the survey only drank wine. You can see the percentage for only drank beer and spirits. But we know that there is some crossover between categories. And so they provide data as far as those who are beer and wine drinkers, beer and spirit drinkers, and wine and spirit drinkers. And then luckily for, for marketers who are trying to appeal to certain consumers who might not currently drink their beverage, but the potential that they could, you can see that 41% of those who participate in the survey that they're drinking across all of the categories. So that gives you a picture as to, we just don't have that one, beer consuming society anymore where that's just the beverage that a majority of consumers who drink alcohol are gravitating to. Though you can see where those beer consumers are also likely to be wine consumers or drink all three alcoholic beverages. So if we take a closer look at wine, which is what kind of corresponds with the topic for today, there has been data that was published, and this is also from 2024 by YouGov. And basically, they take the same stance as Gallup, trying to get a better understanding of consumer sentiment, purchasing attitudes, motivations, across various different topics. And they collected this data you can see the date there for March 5th through 11th of 2024. And basically what they found is that they were able to segment the data based on age ranges. Now, this doesn't necessarily match up with generations for the US, which I've highlighted at the top of the graph for each of those age ranges, how they correspond to generations. But there are some similarities as far as they have, very similar age ranges for those that match up with Gen Zs and millennials, a little bit different as far as the Gen X and boomers. And so the one thing that I like to say is that we don't necessarily want to build a marketing campaign based on generation or based on a particular gender or income level or what have you. All these together help create a profile of a consumer, but demographics are just one portion of it. We also like to look at attitudes and behaviors. What do they drink? How frequently do they drink? And so on and so forth. So what they've done in this particular graph or sets of graphs that I'll show you is basically, yes, they took a look at generations, but within those or age ranges and some corresponding generation overlap. And they were able to take a look at, consumption frequency. So we certainly like to look at this particular type of data, and then we like to take a look at, well, what do we need to exclude? And certainly from the research that we conduct, we certainly are trying to look at those wine consumers who are a little bit more of a frequent consumer. We certainly are interested in those who drink wine perhaps on an infrequent basis, but we know that there's just something that might be a barrier, whether it's real or perceived, that we could kind of help dispel or help them overcome to become more of a frequent wine drinker if they choose to. And so you can kind of see where I've highlighted the bars where if they only drank on a special occasion or never, we would, in a marketing strategy, exclude those consumers from our primary focus of trying to, identify those real likely buyers. And then we can take a little bit closer look and we can see that what has been mainly a way of identifying wine consumers are core, where they're drinking wine at least once a week. And then we have marginal, drinking wine less often, but certainly a couple times a year. And so I think what you might be able to glean from this graph is that there are certain, segments that tend to have higher percentages of those who would be considered core wine consumers compared to others. And really what has been discussed in both the peer-reviewed literature and more of the popular journals or trade journals is that, we have to figure out a way to appeal to these young Gen Zs, but really we're seeing that, an effort should be made to certainly capture the attention of the millennials. You can see the percentages are higher for most of those categories, if not all of them, compared to Gen Z. And then certainly we have our baby boomers, which have traditionally been those wine consuming generation. But certainly we know that with age, there might be some transition from them to stop consuming alcohol so much or at all. And we have these younger generations that we kind of need to better understand in order to appeal to them. So this was one of the questions that I got from the coordinators of the webinar today. And basically, this person wanted to know, well, what can we do to stop the decline in consumption and appeal to those of younger drinking age, and hopefully shift them into a wine consumer or a more frequent wine consumer. And I have to say that across the board, whether it's spirits, beer or wine, we're seeing a decline in consumption of these younger consumers. Some of the strategies that we focused on and that have been mentioned quite a bit in by others who are conducting the research, whether it's a researcher at a university or with an association or an organization that's trying to figure out, what's that silver bullet. There's certain things that can be done, making wine more approachable. Certainly one of the things I'll talk to you about is with our Grüner Veltliner, we found during a focus group session that just somebody trying to say that name, whether in a restaurant or asking for it at a state-run liquor store or another type of retail operation, where if they felt like they couldn't say it or they felt like they were going to be mocked for slaughtering the name, then they may not be likely to ask for it. So that's something where there's been certain brands that have tried to take an approach for maybe not using the whole Grüner Veltliner, but kind of truncating it to make it look like it's a little bit more of an easy way to pronounce the wine, like Groovy. I've seen some brands have used that approach. Focusing on occasions, we know that consumers, there's certain particular types of occasions when a Gen Z will turn to something like a mixed drink, a cocktail, different type of soda and spirits kind of concoction, um, based on being with friends or in certain situations, and then thinking about wine maybe for brunches, something a little bit more formal. So there's been work that has been conducted by others where they're trying to find the way to make wine a little bit more of appropriate for informal occasions too, when you're out with friends, not just necessarily turning to something that might traditionally be thought of as easy and something that can be brought to a barbecue. We need to focus on those kind of situations and dispel those myths and rumors. Looking at sustainability, this is a big one for almost any business that I've been looking into, but it's also about, not just looking at packaging options and how the grapes are produced and how, the certifications for the wine, but really being transparent. This young Gen Z consumer segment is very much aware of what greenwashing is, just taking a label and just kind of or wording and twisting in a way and making it sound like the company is sustainable, but not necessarily following through in all the practices. How wine can fit into a healthy lifestyle. This is one where, again, we see a lot of research that's been published on how wine may not necessarily, alcoholic beverage in overall may not necessarily be something that you would include in a diet. But then there's been other reports where there's other research that shows that perhaps wine might be something that could fit the bill for those who are trying to be more health conscious and considering what they're putting in their bodies. Being authentic. This is one where brands should have a brand story. And really, it's about who they are, why they're in the wine business, for example. What is it about this particular industry or their product that, really gets to their why they're doing it, why they care, why they want to create this beverage that consumers drink. And, what is it about their brand that differentiates them from the brand down the road or the winery down the road. Offering experiences. We know that this consumer segment, Gen Zs, that they are more likely to purchase or spend their money on experiences versus products. So having that type of tasting room occasion where they can come, they can have a great time, take selfies, post them on Instagram, TikTok, create a little FOMO so that their friends feel like they're missing out. So then their friends want to come. And then, of course, identifying products of interest. So the products of interest that have been kind of taken foreground and that are really, we're seeing some movement as far as sales in a positive direction are, the no low alcoholic beverages across the board, in particular beer. But we are seeing that wine, non-alcoholic wine with a 0.5% or less ABV is where the growth is happening in the wine category. We know that if we were to take a look at, wines as far as red, white, rosé, what kind of appeals, and white wines, which I'll share some more data with you, are where we're seeing a lot of positive traction, as well as rosés and sparkling wines, particularly Prosecco, though champagne is starting to see a little bit of an uptick in the U.S. market. Ready to drink, so these would be your hard seltzers, and there are, even though about a majority of the hard seltzer market is malt based, we are seeing that about 2% is wine based, and that might seem like a very small percentage, and it is, but the growth from year to year is pretty significant. We see a lot of wines that have a fruity flavor to them in addition to the grapes. So something that would be strawberry, watermelon, a lot of tropical fruits, a lot of citrus. There's I believe that it is pineapple is one of the top flavors for alcoholic beverages across the board, but certainly there's a lot of added latitude there for wine. And moving from fruity, where we're starting to see people have a fruity kind of overload with the products, into savory. So there are some wines that have a kick to them, a spiciness to them, and we're expecting to see more. And then I've talked about the sustainability piece, but in addition to those low no alcoholic beverages, and for wine, anything with an ABV of 14.6 or higher, which can be quite of a powerful ABV. We're seeing that there's some real growth for that particular category based on ABV. So there are some bright spots, and then there's certainly some efforts that the wine industry is implementing. There's two particular efforts. There's the Share and Pair Sundays, which took place, you can see, from March to June 2025. I'm sure this effort will continue. We're basically, getting people together on Sundays, glass of wine, talk, communicate, build communities. And then last October, which will again be repeated this October, is Come Over October, where basically, again, not just necessarily focusing on, trying to get people to drink, but trying to get people together, and using wine as something where, you're sharing the experience together. So both of these efforts are ground up, kind of grassroots efforts, and they both have a presence on Instagram for sure. And so you can certainly check them out, but I expect that we're going to see more of these types of efforts to come out, and to just kind of make consumers aware of how wine can play a role in getting people together, and not just celebrating those big momentous occasions, but those everyday celebrations as well. So as far as the Mid-Atlantic wine industry, and I think this is one where some of the statistics that I'll show you, perhaps you are aware of, perhaps you are not, because we are kind of like this hidden little gem. We are what would be called an emerging wine industry. And certainly there are some really great statistics to support why we need to be concerned about the industry in the Mid-Atlantic and need to grow along with the population, with other opportunities. So if I were to show you, a listing of the top 5 or so grape production states in the US, certainly I'm sure California would come to mind, probably Oregon, probably Texas, probably, Washington State. And so you may be aware that New York and Pennsylvania also produce a fair amount of grapes. And so this is for a bearing and non-bearing acreage. So if vines are planted, they're counted within this particular data set. And this is the Ag Census, which is conducted every 5 years. I don't have the information for New Jersey because of the data that I had access to, but you can imagine that a smaller state probably not necessarily in the rankings, at least not within the top 10. If we were to take a look at Pennsylvania in particular, where are grapes grown? Certainly, I'll just use my pointer up here in Erie, where you can see that number is fairly high. And, if you're from Erie or just familiar with the industry there, you're going to find that it's a fair amount are Concord grapes. But also right here in central Pennsylvania, we have, Center County. This is the number of acres. And so down here, Lancaster, you can see pockets where we've got a fair number of acreage. What we don't have access to are what particular grapes are grown on those acres. How many of those 92 acres that are reported for Center County are a Gruner, are a different type of grape, a different variety. We don't have that information available to us. Michela Gentinari, who is our viticulturist, who's an associate professor in my department, would love to have access to that information, as well as Kane Hickey, who is a teaching professor of viticulture. That would be most beneficial to their programs. But number of wineries as well. We're certainly towards the top of the stack as far as being sixth place with 401 wineries as of January of this year. So, certainly we've got our share of wineries. And New York's a little bit ahead of us, but again, the West Coast is where we see a fair amount of those facilities. And certainly New Jersey, you can see the number there. One thing to point out is that we do have this wonderful reputation and history of wine and wineries in Pennsylvania. And so you can see that, more than 330 years ago, we had, Fairmount Park was where William Penn planted a vineyard. And you're not more than 1 hour from a winery, at least one winery in Pennsylvania, no matter where you are. So easy to perhaps get to, depending on, where you live, but you can always reach one within at least an hour. And then lastly, the number of visitors that come to the Mid-Atlantic region, which is something that, we're benefits us all if we live there and other areas where you may live. And certainly there's probably statistics that are very similar. But you can see the number of visitors that come annual or came in 2022. You can see tourism, or the total economic impact of anything that had to do with grapes, wine, and tourism. And you can see the percentage that is from tourism. So these are fairly significant numbers, and certainly something that propels, the state, the Commonwealth, and the surrounding areas to take a look at how can we make best use of this information and make our states these destination places for the wine consumer, if not the overall alcoholic beverage consumer. So one of the things that I've really been kind of working on since I started my focus on the alcoholic beverage industry is working with others in the Mid-Atlantic region. I have close contacts with people at Cornell, people at Rutgers University, and then others within the Penn State system. And so we've really been looking at what are those things that we can do to, to learn about consumers in the Mid-Atlantic region, because we know that Pennsylvania wines are purchased by those who live outside of the Commonwealth. So we really want to have this overall concerted effort. Sometimes we focused on just New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. Other times, depending on funding, we've had a broader footprint and included Ohio and other states that border the Pennsylvania. So we take a look at all kinds of things, first starting off with, who is that Pennsylvania or Mid-Atlantic wine consumer, taking a look at products that they're interested in consuming. Certainly COVID, had a huge impact on the wine industry as well as others, where there were a limited number of people who could come to a winery. Many of the times the tastings had to take place outdoors. Certainly we saw an increase in alcoholic beverage consumption during COVID. Now after COVID, there's still some wineries that are still, trying to get their a system back in place to accommodate people in the wineries, to encourage people to come back to the wineries. We did see a little bit of a dip after COVID, if you want to call it that period, where consumers weren't necessarily going to winery tasting rooms as they had been before the pandemic. And then certainly we understand that people like to, go to festivals, and we know that that is a huge connector between small producers and consumers. So we want to understand, what motivates them to go to those festivals, other types of agritourism activities that could occur on the tasting room grounds, figuring out how to communicate with consumers. Text messaging is one that we've taken a look at, as a way to break through all of the noise on social media and connect directly with consumers on their cell phones, where either through WhatsApp or another type of messaging system. And then taking a look at the product itself. Are we able to craft a front and back label that's going to contain valuable information, in hopes that that person who is picking up a bottle of wine based on, what that label looks like, what can we do to encourage them to pick up a bottle of Pennsylvania wine? What are some of the things that we can do script wise, or colors, or any type of characters that we can incorporate. And of course it would be different from brand to brand, but even on the back label, what kind of information can we share, or how we get information to them that's easy, quick, and that they're going to rely on, and then remember our brand when they think about how easy it was to select the bottle. So that brings us to Gruner. And so this is a particular topic that we are still looking at. We still have data from a second survey. What I'm going to share with you today is from 2019. And so it takes a while to kind of go through the data, figure out ways to analyze it. And this was something that was published in the International Journal of Wine Business Research in 2024. And we like to acknowledge that the Pennsylvania Wine Marketing and Research Board provided funding for this project. And this was a project that looked at production, grape production, winemaking, and marketing. So through the whole, from farm to consumer. And so why would we even want to take a look at even looking at the topic of signature grapes? And so if I were to show you a map of the world, you would see that, there's probably certain areas where if you're a wine drinker, you're focusing in on, and you recognize as being an old world wine country where it's been produced since, as far back as history has been recorded. And, there's certain characteristics in others where they're new wine world countries, and they've got some different types of wines and strategies that they're looking at. So, to give you an idea, if I were to say Portugal or Spain, these particular varietals may come to mind, or Tuscany. If you've been to Italy, there's certain types of tours and all kinds of structure around the wine industry, and the beautiful areas, and really, making that a main focus to encourage consumers to visit. Traveling on to, new world wine countries, Australia, Syrah, you probably equate that with Australia, Sauvignon Blanc. I believe about 75%, if not more, of the white wine that is produced in New Zealand is Sauvignon Blanc. And then South Africa as well, and Chenin Blanc, really known for that particular grape and the wine that's made from it. Moving further on, Malbec from Argentina. And then if we go to the States, there's certain certain states that I might say where you kind of, if you're that wine drinker, you might have, make the connection between particular varietals that are made from those grapes. And so, not too far from us in the Finger Lakes, if many people associate that with Riesling. So, there's some evidence that shows that, this is not going to be an overall strategy where it's going to make certain states, rise to the top of the list that people think of when they think of wine. But somehow there's a way that these signature grapes, these signature wines, have created, kind of this story that can marketers and the industry can tell to consumers, where they start to learn about why this particular grape does well in the vineyard, and why this particular wine tastes great based on the terroir where it is those factors that impact, the grape that's being harvested. And so this was a main question that one of the participants asked when they signed up is, how was Gruner chosen? And that, they're just curious about this. So basically what you do is you kind of take a look at, well, where's consumer consumption going? What are the trends within sales and consumption? And so this is just at that time. You can see for 2019, which is when we conducted the study, this data shows that, or these data show that from 2022 to 2021, you can kind of see the progression of the increase in the yellow bars, which coordinate to white wines as far as consumption in the US, where, red is certainly there's years where it ticks above the 10 on the left-hand side, but, overall, you can see without the actual numbers being there that yellow part of each bar for those years is gradually increasing. So that, certainly helps us take a look at, narrowing down the choices. And consumption is just one aspect of it. I'll share more as to how this really got its start, as far as Gruner being the focus of the overall effort. And so we know that for certain generations that, perhaps a red heavy wine with tannins may not necessarily be something that they are that they gravitate towards. Perhaps there's food pairings that white work better with. And so, trying to have that overall wine experience, looking for wines that correspond with the foods that they enjoy consuming, which I'll show you in a little bit. And then, there's certain types of characters about white wines that, according to the resources that I have on the slide, indicating that white wines work very well for today's consumers and what they're looking for, that lower alcohol content, that fresher style, the lighter. There are a number of other instances where those who work for particular associations, indicate that it's, it could be price as well, that there's certain red wines which maybe consumers associate with higher prices, but maybe they think of whites as being more affordable. There's a number of reasons. And also I saw an article not too long ago where Taylor Swift, if you're a Swiftie fan, you probably, and are familiar with her music, you probably have heard her mention white wines a number of times in her music. When she's been interviewed, and there's a lot of videos of her drinking white wines. So that probably is, though they did not say it in the article, perhaps there's a little bit of an influence there when somebody in the entertainment world picks up a particular type of alcoholic beverage. Then we do see, down the stream that consumer super trends change a little bit. But Gruner also has this, wide range of different styles, sweet to dry, and where there's certainly a style that matches with those food items that are trending right now, spicier foods, more of an ethnic type of food. And, it's really is a very versatile grape. So this is kind of, what kind of starts the wheels turning, where you can see on the right-hand side, we don't have any tannins there, which again is probably what, makes this appeal to certain consumers who don't like the high tannin wines. And you can see that there's not quite dry, but, it's certainly got an alcoholic ABV level that falls in line with table wine. So it's not going to be something that would be consumers might perceive as being overpowering. So overall, a very versatile wine. And if you're not familiar where Gruner is kind of what country Gruner is associated with, it is Austria. So certainly, it's grown in Italy and surrounding countries, and there's a fair amount in Australia and New Zealand. But, when people think of white wine with in Austria, they often think of Gruner. So you can see here some statistics from 2023 as far as the percent of wine production area in Austria where Gruner accounts for that. And you can see I've circled what is the lower Austria region where the Gruner is grown, and certainly a quarter of the value and the volume, approximately a quarter of the value and the volume in 2023 is associated with Gruner. So it's a very successful varietal there, and so more specific to Pennsylvania. It was first planted in 2004. I'll share a little bit more with you about one of the first producers. For our group, our Penn State wine and grape team, the Michaela Centenari and her grad student, produced ran field trials to make sure that it could be produced in Pennsylvania. There were sensory evaluations that not necessarily focused on whether consumers liked the taste or mouthfeel or other sensory characteristics, but that there could be some ways to understand the key sensory attributes, minerality, some other types of sensory descriptors. And then we have PA wine producers who have received both domestic and international accolades and awards for their Grüner. And so this leads to one of the questions that I received was how many acres of Grüner are grown in Pennsylvania and where's the best growing region or area for the variety. And so this is one, again, which relates back to the ag census. We don't have any statistical reference to draw from as far as where Grüner is produced or how many acres, but it does look as if you were to take a look at the wineries who do produce Grüner for a commercial scale, that they correspond to Erie, some of the areas where we have higher numbers of acreage, especially down in the southeast as well. And if you are from the southeast, perhaps you are familiar with Galen Glen, where just a little bit about why they chose Grüner. You can see that their microclimate for an area where they produce Grüner is very similar to Austria. And so there's other areas in Pennsylvania which have that type of environment that very much mimics Austria, and makes them suitable places to grow this particular variety. For our research, we decided, well, if that's, if there's the case for that they can be produced in Pennsylvania, perhaps not the whole state, not every county, but certainly the main wine regions. And there was a way to figure out what our Grüner in Pennsylvania tasted like as far as sensory characteristics. Let's figure out whether consumers actually want to purchase and try this particular type of wine before we start producing or start putting a lot of effort into a signature program. So we conduct our research, and we using Danetta. They are a source of panelists, people who have been vetted for filling out surveys. It's a source that I've been using ever since I've been at Penn State. And basically, the consumers are vetted. We get to screen consumers based on criteria that we have, which here, as you can see, for the Grüner research. And basically, we can look through the data that they provide us. And if we find that any respondents may not necessarily have completed the survey or have gone through at such a fast rate that we don't really trust that particular response, we can remove it from the data set, and it becomes very useful for us. We have a lot of control over the quality and with the various types of ways that we clean the data, and also the various questions that we do for attention checks that we put throughout the survey. So some of the things we're interested in, are consumers familiar with Grüner? Would they be interested in sampling and purchasing it? Is there going to be a difference in interest based on consumption frequency, those that consume very frequently versus those who would on occasion consume a wine? And so willingness to purchase, willingness to pay what price? And then, are there other influences such as attitudes and behaviors about wine that would be something that would influence a purchase? So to give you some ideas to who we tend to attract, and this is very typical for surveys at that time, we had about 1,000 people participate in the survey, or at least attempt the survey to answer the questions. But we were able, for this particular paper, use 676 participants' responses, and because they answered a set of questions that we needed in order to make to work on the analysis, to provide the data from a particular type of analysis. And we tried to do our best to get a good segmentation of generation, to include those who are Gen Zs, though at the time that the survey was conducted, we certainly had fewer Gen Zs who were above the legal drinking age of 21. But, we typically get a more female audience as opposed to males, which is seems to be what we experience with other surveys looking at other products. And then you can see that our breakdown of state of residence really does kind of mimic the overall population of the 3 states and give you an idea about the education level. We're always interested in what are those characteristics that are going to encourage somebody to or impede them from making an alcoholic beverage purchase. And from other research, we know that consumers, if they're living in a household with one other adult who drinks alcoholic beverage, more likely somebody that they're in a romantic relationship with, but regardless, that that can very much influence their purchasing behaviors. So we found that, we had a fair percentage that had lived in a household with at least one other adult 21 and older. And that of those, about 74%, those other adults drank wine. Luckily for us, we were able to get a fairly good overview of high frequency consumers, those that drank wine at least once a week. Occasional, they drank wine at least once every 3 months. And then the infrequent consumers. So we kept those in because we just were very much exploring the topic, and we didn't want to exclude any particular type of wine consumer because we were unsure as to who would be that Grüner Veltliner likely buyer. And one of the questions we asked is if they were familiar with Gruner. We found that we had about 12% had drunk the wine before. We found a few more, 21% were familiar with the wine. And then you can see there a great majority were not. But what luckily happened in this instance is that compared to those who are unfamiliar, you can see all of the positive things that we could work with for those who were familiar with or had drunk Gruner before. So households that had one or more consumers in addition to the participant who drank wine, they had consumed and liked Pennsylvania wine, which was key for us because if we're trying to promote a Pennsylvania wine, we want to make sure that consumers, are willing to purchase it or at least try it. You can see some of the other details there. So what about those who are unfamiliar or just to refresh their memories and then figure out whether they're willing to try a Pennsylvania or even an Austrian Gruner? And then what about likelihood of looking for and purchasing it? And so just to go through this definition real quick, certainly we had to get them a little bit familiar with what Gruner was. This is a definition from Wine Enthusiast, but basically, yes, it's this, the wording could very much, encourage somebody to maybe not necessarily want to try it based on some of the sensory characteristics there. But this was a well used definition and one that we felt that we could present to consumers from a well-known source and get the response to it. What was very worked out very well for us is that we found in both cases, interest and likelihood, that consumers were interested, either somewhat interested or very interested, to taste Gruner. And you can see the percentages for Austria and Pennsylvania. When we took a look at those who were familiar or had drunk the wine before, you can see that the level of interest for the percentage of those somewhat to very interested increased further. So this helped us, kind of reaffirm in our minds that it was worth pursuing. Certainly if we found that our data where a great percentage were interested in Austrian Gruner, but not so much Pennsylvania, then we would kind of have to think about, well, what is that gap? How do we kind of cross over that chasm to shift consumer sentiment from so that they're more on an equal playing field. When it came to likelihood of looking for and purchasing, the percentages were still, again, very positive, and even more so when we took a look at those who had drunk or were familiar with Gruner, that we, again, if these percentages had been lower, we would have to go back and kind of think about, well, what kind of questions do we need to ask? What kind of information do we need to glean to be able to figure out who that consumer is that would be likely to look for it in a state-run liquor store or online and make a purchase? There's often the case in food and in particular, and as well as beverage, that there's this particular type of lean towards finding that consumer who's kind of more adventurous and seeing whether they are the ones that would maybe be more likely to purchase or to try a wine that they may not necessarily be familiar with. And so there's a variety of questions we can ask, and we could score consumers on based on their responses using a scale of 1 to 7, one being very strongly disagree, 7 being strongly agree, where we can figure out whether they are a variety avoider, meaning that they just want their regular type of wine. They are very much not going to choose something that is new, unique, that they can't pronounce, that they haven't seen before, or variety seeker, that person who's just willing to try something new, even if that it just sounds completely odd out there, the description, they're willing to try it. So we are able to take our consumers who participate in the survey based on their responses and divide them into those two groups. And for us, based on the literature, variety seekers are those ones that they're looking for more unique wines. They spend more on wine, they consume more on wine, they have their perception of their wine knowledge is higher, and that they're more confident in making wine purchases. So we thought, well, this would be good. This is something that we really want to take a look at and see if perhaps there is a difference between low and high variety seekers. For us, we got about, depending on how you split the data, but we wanted to make sure that we were able to capture those who were low and high, and you can see our percentages there. And what has worked out very well is that, kind of going along with some of the data that I showed you previously, there's a lot of positives that kind of correspond with the high VAR-seek participants. You can see they're more familiar with or had drunk the wine, Grüner Veltliner before, Gen Z's, millennials. So we can kind of take a look at that and see if, it's that new generation or those younger generations that are interested in this kind of unique wine. We see a lot of positives that could very much play in our favor if we're going to focus on these high VAR-seek consumers. Purchase wine from tasting rooms and festivals or events. And so we know that particular interaction that a consumer has with a tasting room owner or operator, whether on premise or off, is sometimes key to the purchase. But should we focus on just these high VAR seekers, consumers? And so, because when we took a look at our data and we divided them based on whether they were high VAR seekers, those really kind of looking for that new and unique kind of wine, or low, they wanted to stick with their standard wine that they were used to drinking. And then, their likelihood of looking for and purchasing Pennsylvania Grüner Veltliners, we had 45% who were high VAR seek, high and likely to purchase Pennsylvania Grüner Veltliner. But we also had this 21% that was there that, they were likely to purchase Pennsylvania Grüner Veltliner, but they were low on the VAR-seek scale. So do we just exclude them, or do we see if there's differences? And so I'm going to skip ahead because of time, but basically what we found is that when we compared the two groups, there were some differences. So in many instances, that high VAR-seek, high likely to look for and purchase Pennsylvania wines, they were more likely to have purchased Pennsylvania wines before, compared to those who are low VAR-seek but still likely to purchase a Pennsylvania Grüner. You can see that where they purchased their wine from, a higher percentage of those in the high VAR-seek likely had purchased from liquor stores, winery tasting rooms, wineries at events. So that was key, that interaction. We need to work on that, as a way to motivate people to go to tasting rooms and what have you, as a way to building connections. And hopefully, what we found is that being able to sample the wine was key for many of these consumers. And so one place that you can sample the wine prior to purchase is at a tasting room where the winery makes the wine. And then using wine-focused magazines as a way to alert consumers. What we didn't find a difference between the two groups was their their willingness to purchase based on various price points. You can see that probably that $20 to $29 range is where, a fair about 37% to 42%, whether you're looking at the high or the low of our Varsiques. Consumers, they're willing to pay that price, a similar percentage to in the $15 to $19 range. But we didn't see differences as far as whether one group was willing to pay that price more than the other, as well as wine frequency. They consumed wine at least once a week, the same percentages, no significant difference between the two there. So this gave us all of this kind of ammunition together, gave us the overall picture that yes, we do have a consumer segment in who drinks white wine in the Mid-Atlantic region who's who's interested in tasting Grüner and willing to look for and purchase it. That, if we're looking based on a strategy, just on familiarity with Grüner Veltliner, we do want to take a look at those who were familiar with and or had drunk the wine before, not the familiar. That would probably take a larger marketing effort to be able to appeal to those consumers. It's the younger generations, those Gen Zs and millennials that had drunk or were familiar with the wine. There were a greater percentage of them than baby boomers. Perhaps baby boomers who participated in our survey were more likely to be to want to stick with what they had turned to as their regular wine that they drank. And then Varsique, yes, we can focus on those low Varsique consumers who are likely to buy Pennsylvania wines, Pennsylvania Grüners, but we definitely need to first start with those that are high Varsique on the scale, and likely because it seems like would be less of an effort to try to get them into tasting rooms where they'd be able to try the wine, and they probably already, because of the frequency with which they visit tasting rooms, they probably already have communicated with tasting room owners and operators and have an idea as to what types of wines are available. So another question, will the potential signature wine be chosen by sommeliers? Will consumers have a role in it? And so this is where, where we're at this point. This is something that's going to be an effort that will have to be supported by all sectors of the industry. The Pennsylvania Winery Association, we probably will need to use sommeliers to promote the product, we know that consumers very much buy particular products, and wine included, based on accolades, notices, different types of write-ups, Instagram posts, where some sort of expert is talking about all the good things that this particular wine can offer as far as sensory appeals and what have you. So this is something where this would have to be talked about in a larger group, by a larger group, and kind of developed over time. And then lastly, who would design the label and bottle for the potential design? So basically what this is we would just be identifying that varietal, that wine that would be made from a particular grape that would serve as a signature grape, or one of a signature wine, or one of a couple signature wines, present it to the industry, and then they would very much design their own bottle and label. It would just kind of fall within the selections of wines that they produce and make available to consumers, and just be one of the choices that they would make available on the commercial scale. And I know I always talk more than what I always anticipate, but I have, if you're interested in the alcoholic beverage industry, I write a trends article each year, and then the one that is published for 2025 is available via that QR code, and then I can open it up for questions. And please feel free to reach out to me at any point if you have questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
It looks kind of like there is the one question in the chat, although I can't tell. Did you copy that one in there that you got from someone else? Oh, no, okay, yeah. It's from Kelley. I was
Oh, okay.
at a glance, I thought it said Kathy Kelley, but no, different name.
So I'm going to basically the question is um, oh, so it sounds like that the person gave Grüner a try before, maybe didn't necessarily enjoy the experience, and ended up with a Chardonnay, I believe, as far as maybe going back to that particular choice. But hopefully just that one particular instance. Yes, I know it's very difficult to try something when you may not have had the best experience or the experience that you hope for, but hopefully you'll try that again. I think that there are a number of different brands, producers on the East Coast, especially in Pennsylvania, and that just like some other wines that you may be familiar with, the sensory, the taste, the sensory kind of characteristics might differ very much from one to another.
Well, thank you, Kathy. I don't see any other questions in the chat, at least. This was so much information in a good way. I learned more. I'm primarily a beer drinker, so I learned more about
Oh, okay.
wine today than I think I knew in my entire life. But this was really wonderful. I really appreciate you taking the time. Again, I know you shared the QR code there that hopefully folks had, and your contact information that folks had a chance to follow up if needed. But I think we will wrap it up. Again, thank you for your time, Kathy, and then also want to thank everybody who tuned in today, and a reminder that folks can find the full list of current and past sessions at alumni.psu.edu/events. So Kathy, thanks again, and thanks to everyone who tuned in.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.